What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. I want to talk about the color line, what it meant to boxing, what was the effects of the color line. Did it help or hurt the game of boxing? How many world champions would you have had the color line not been in effect? Between the first, second, and third wave of Black Murderers Row, who did it hurt? What Hall of Famers became Hall of Famers or were denied of being a Hall of Famer because of the colored line? Let's talk about it. But I want to first shout out my sister, Lala D. I've known Lala D for over 4.5 years. One of the most realest persons you'll ever meet. You see, it was Lala D who reached out to me. After my first video, I worked on a project for 7 months. It was a collage of every fighter, every champion from the 1800s to 2018. And after uploading that video of my collage, I sat back for a few months. It was Lala D who reached out to me and said, "Scrapbook, that was a beautiful video, but you got more work to do." And I thought about that. So I only planned on doing that one video. And from that point, I've done videos since. And I got to shout out TraeX. It was because of TraeX that I met Lala D. It was because of TraeX I met Curtis Anderson. But it was TraeX who gave Curtis Anderson the name Sugar. And TraeX, my opinion, is the best blow-by-blow announcer since the legendary Don Dumphy. And I told him that. "Oh, Scrap, no." I said, "Yes. Absolutely." TraeX gives trivias in boxing. He wants to help educate the audience. And for that, I salute TraeX. But Lala D, TraeX, shout out to you. The color line. What was the effects of the color line? How did it hurt or help the game of pugilism? Who would become champion and who would not become champion? How many Hall of Famers would you have had it not been for the color line? How many black fighters would be in the Hall of Fame if the color line did not exist? Would Harry Wiley Sr. would be in the Hall of Fame as a trainer if the color line did not exist? Would Jack Blackburn be in the Boxing Hall of Fame as a fighter if the color line did not exist? These are the questions that need answers. Would some white champions be in the Hall of Fame had the color line not exist? And it's a fair question. When you look at Harris Pearl Martin, 1865, 1903. Harris Martin became the colored world middleweight champion when he defeated Black Frank in Minneapolis, Minnesota. May 2nd, 1887. He would knock him out in 38 rounds. Harris Martin would lose his world-colored middleweight championship crown to Ed Bendley, November 30th, 1891, in San Francisco, California. Now, the same year, Black Prince Peter Jackson would go 61 rounds with Gentleman Jim Corbett. Black Prince Peter Jackson had a cousin named Peter Felix. And Peter Felix wrote a piece in an article, newspaper article. And he talked about the sparring match that he had with a specific fighter. And he bared witness to his cousin, Peter Jackson, playing around in the ring with a specific fighter. And he talked about how easy it was for Peter Jackson to handle this man that is in the Hall of Fame. Peter Jackson would become the Australian and the colored heavyweight champion. He would become the colored heavyweight champion when he knocked out Old Chocolate, George Godfrey, in 19 rounds. He would retire from the ring and relinquish his title. He would die at the tender age of 40. Young man. But he never got a chance to fight for the world title, the established title. Because Peter Jackson and George Godfrey would knock on the door of Boston strongman John O'Sullivan. John O'Sullivan would become the bare knuckle champion in the heavyweight division in 1882. He took on Joe Gauss, and he would win that title from Paddy Ryan. But he would never give Peter Jackson, George Godfrey, Byers, none of them a shot. February 29th, 1892, second world colored middleweight champion, Ed Bendley. Born April 19th, 1864, Washington, District of Columbia. He died between 1888 and 1892. Stood 5 foot 9 inches, weighed 154 pounds. He was the world colored middleweight champion. He took on Old Chocolate, George Godfrey, Joe Butler, Jack Pearl, Harris Martin, Jonathan Banks. Ed Bendley was KO'd by a fighter by the name of Charlie Turner. Charlie Turner was known as the Stockton Cyclone. He never defended the title when he had it. Couldn't get the big fights. Charlie Turner, Stockton Cyclone, born 1862 in Stockton, California. He died August 13th, 1913 in Stockton, California. Stood 5 foot 10 inches, weighed 148 to 156 pounds. Fought from August 6, 1884 to December 19th, 1904. Stood in the ring with fighters such as Martin Buffalo Castillo, Jim Hall, Soldier James Martin, Patty Gorsman, Black Pearl Martin, Wally Evans. November 18th, 92. 11-round draw with the colored world lightweight champion, Bobby Dobbs, San Francisco, California. 1899. One draw, one loss to young Peter Jackson. January 6th, San Jose, California. August 7th, Stockton, California. You look at Frank Childs, the crafty Texan, born 1870. July 17th, 1867 will be the year of his death. He would reside in Chicago, Illinois. Now, he stood 5 foot 9.5 inches, weighed 160 pounds to 185 pounds. Faced world-colored heavyweight champion, Harris Pearl Martin, Joe Walcott, Kentucky Rosebud, Joe Byers, Bob Armstrong, and Denver Ed Martin. would also take on Jack Johnson, Bobby Dobbs, Hank Griffin, Peter Jackson, and Dan Creedon. Dan Creedon was a European middleweight champion. He'd have his wars with Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler. Those two men would fight several times. But Frank Childs and Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler, and I go into further details about him, would never receive a title shot. September 14th, 1898, George Byers, New York. We're losing 20 rounds. Colored World Heavyweight Championship against Frank Childs. It's an unofficial record match that took place May 1899 between George Byers and the Barbados Demon, Joe Walcott. They supposedly met in George Godfrey's gym. Now, Byers weighed 168 pounds. He would stop Joe Walcott. Walcott weighed 150 pounds. These men would have to face each other several times because they couldn't get a title shot. Black Frank Taylor, World Colored Middleweight Champion, May 2nd, 1887. Black Pearl Martin, Minneapolis, Minnesota. He would lose to him by stoppage in 38 rounds. He claimed the Colored World Middleweight Championship belt. The Darky Wizard, Jonathan Banks, better known as Joe Butler. Walter Eggington, all fighters that would be in the ring with one another. Non-parallel, Jack Dempsey, Jack Ash, Ed Bendley, George Dixon, Jack Root would all be opponents of this magnificent fighter. Now, the World Colored Middleweight Championship would take effect when the World Negro Middleweight Champion, Jonathan Banks, who was born December 25th, 1861, Richmond, Virginia. He was known as the Darky Wizard. January 26, 1887 in New York. He would claim the Negro Middleweight Championship title. Lose the title, James Diverseny. It was a 9th round disqualification. Diverseny never defended that title. John Banks would next face World Colored Middleweight Champion Ed Bendley, Boston, Massachusetts. 13 rounds. It would become a draw. From that point, the Negro Middleweight Championship title would become extinct. And the Colored Middleweight Championship title would now be officially in effect. According to the crowd, Jonathan Banks and Ed Bendley somewhat sparred with one another. And each of them would cause the boxing promoters to withhold their purses. World Colored Middleweight Championship was under investigation. James Diverseny would never defend his crown. Now the Negro Middleweight Championship crown will be extinct. The Colored Middleweight Championship crown will be discovered. George Byers would hold that mantle. He was managed by Tom Milwaukee. George Byers was born June 25th, 1872 in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. That's in Canada. Died April 10th, 1937. Weighed 120 to 165 pounds. Beating with Charlie Strong. Now, Charlie Strong would lose the vacant heavyweight championship title match with Bob Armstrong, who was known as the king of the battle royale. And that title became vacant when the Black Prince Peter Jackson would release it. George Byers would also take on fighters such as Black Fitzsimmons. His name was Kid Monday. I'll discuss him in a moment. Dick Moore and Harris Pepper. Frank Childs. Byers would defeat Harris Peppers, who was the Pacific Coast middleweight champion. Colored World Middleweight Champion became Colored World Heavyweight Champion in 1898. That was magnificent because here you had a middleweight who would now become a heavyweight. And he would hold the middleweight and the heavyweight championship crown. But you know something? As remarkable as that is, Sam Langford would not only become the colored middleweight champion, but he would become the colored heavyweight champion 5 times. These men had to fight each other. They were never given an opportunity at the established championship belt. Frank Craig, who was known as the Harlem Coffee Cooler, was born April 1st, 1868 in Columbus, Georgia. He died 1943, Chelsea, London, England. Stood 5 foot 10 inches, weighed 160 to 162.5 pounds. He was a resident of Harlem, New York. He would claim the vacant World Colored Middleweight Championship crown, February 20th, 1894. He would have a broken hand, causing him not to defend that title. And according to those who were in the audience, they felt that the Harlem Thunderbolt is one of the most scientific boxers they have ever seen. Now, we look at the definition. During the Civil War, coffee cooler came from a prominence. The phrase was used for soldiers who looked for least dangerous and difficult duties. They would label Frank Craig as the Harlem Coffee Cooler. But it had another meaning. That coffee was normally black if you didn't put cream in it. So they would look at Frank Craig as coffee. But the true definition during the Civil War meant that a man looked for easy work. And that's when they would label black fighters as having a yellow streak. George Byers, his mother was Mi'kmaq Indian. His father was a black slave. He had escaped to the north and to Canada. He would reside in Prince Edward Island, along with Sam Langford and George Godfrey, George Byers, and many others. Would all make the decisions to escape to America. He also lived as a hobo, as did Jack Dempsey and Henry Armstrong, Sam Langford, and George Godfrey, and many others. And they would reside in Boston, Massachusetts. In the 1880s, he would become somewhat of a hobo. And you could find him at the Hub City waterfront. George Byers would become physically stronger in the work that he would do at the Hub City waterfront. He would carry over 100 pounds in each arm, delivering concrete in buckets, walking up and down steps with a long, heavy-duty tree trunk over his shoulders. He would become an amateur wrestler, winning many trophies in tournaments. George Byers would meet fellow Canadian and Boston resident George Godfrey. And George Godfrey would school George Byers. He would tutor him, along with other black fighters such as Sam Langford, who ran away to America for a better way of life. They would run in between boxcars, hiding from flat-footed cops and those who wanted to deport them. And they would actually get to the point where they had to grab underneath the train and travel until the next stop. That train was doing over 150 miles per hour. If they slipped and fell, it would be crushed into pieces. Hanging in a somewhat push-up position upside down underneath the train, not knowing whether there was something in the middle of the tracks that would crush them. This is what had to happen for black fighters to go from state to state. December 9th, 1887, George Byers would become the colored world middleweight champion in Connecticut. He knocked out Harry Peppers in 19 rounds. That would be the same amount of rounds that the Black Prince Peter Jackson would knock out Old Chocolate George Godfrey in for the colored World Heavyweight Championship title. Now, in his 20th recorded professional bout, his name would be known all over the South. 1793, Eli Whitley had created and invented the cotton gin. It's a mechanism that was used to separate seeds from the cotton. 1808, 1860, over 4 million slaves were used for profit sharing to produce wealth for plantation owners. This took place in the South, where they were at one point in time picking tobacco leaves. They would reduce to picking cotton. And occasionally they would pick up rice and peanuts, etc. In 1831, Nat Turner, a slave who decided to rebel against the acts of slavery, he would take a lot of men with him. A lot of those men would become prize fighters. 1849, Richard K. Fox, who was the editor of the popular Police Gazette magazine, truly racist newspaper. New York Clippers would declare Daniel Knox as the first colored champion. He fought only with other black fighters and slaves. Richard K. Fox would see a market for these events, such as fight to the death matches, battle royales. He would begin to advertise colored championship boxing tournaments. And you would get more black fighters once these tournaments would be created. He would begin the Heavyweight Championship Series. Fighters such as Morris Grant, Professor Charles Hadley, George Godfrey, The prize ring will be a golden cup and the right to be called the colored champion. Old Chocolate, George Godfrey, would challenge John O'Sullivan of Boston. He challenged Joe Gauss for the America's Bare Knuckle Heavyweight Championship. 1882. John O'Sullivan would take on Paddy Ryan. Harriet Tubman led hundreds of slaves through the Underground Railroad. She was a spy for the Union military. In exchange, information from military officers for escaping slaves. It will let her know when and where slaves can run without being seen. Many of these slaves would become prize fighters. They would accept challenges in exchange for housing and money. 1850s throughout the 1860s. By 1863, 186,000 black soldiers would join the Union Army by the time the war had ended. 1865, 38,000 lost their lives. Many ex-black soldiers would decide to become fisticuff prize fighters. And it became serious at this point because these men were very strong. They had a very strong constitution. And when you hold back a person, that person becomes dangerous when the opportunity comes their way. 1870, Reconstruction, separate but not equal. Jim Crow laws, schools and barbershops, restaurants and theaters were divided, which means you were not able, as a black human being, to even walk into the establishment, let alone sit in a divided area. You could be hung. May 18th, 1869. Percy versus Ferguson, 14th Amendment. Provisions of full and equal citizenship of African Americans. Booker T. Washington, George Washington Carver, W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey. 15th Amendment, equal education. Brown versus Board of Education. You look at Sam Langford, who was born as a young man who was abused in his household. He was known as the Boston Bone Crusher. 1886, Weymouth Falls, Digby's County. He was born in Canada. He died January 12th, 1956. He stood 5'6" and 3/4 inches, had a 74-inch reach. He was a feather light, welterweight, middleweight, and heavyweight. Had over 256 total bouts, 180 wins, 128 knockouts, 29 losses, 39 draws, 200 no contests, no decisions. And half of his record is not on file. He was in the ring with Joe Gans December 8th, 1903. Joe Gans was the first black lightweight champion in boxing history. He was in the ring with Joe Walcott November 5th, 1904. Joe Gans was the first black welterweight in boxing history. He was in the ring with Theodore Tiger Flowers, 1922. Theodore Tiger Flowers was the first black middleweight champion in boxing history. He would become the first black middleweight champion 1926, when he would defeat the Pittsburgh windmiller, Harry Greb, New York's Madison Square Garden. Sam Langford was in a ring with Jack Johnson, who at that time was the colored heavyweight champion. But he would become the first black heavyweight champion, 1908, when he would defeat Noah Busso, Tommy Burns, fought Jack Johnson April 26, 1906, for the colored heavyweight championship title. Be in a ring with Lee Anderson, Dixie Kid, Bowling Jim Johnson, Kid Norfolk, Klondike Haynes, Jeff Clark, Joplin Ghost, Bill Tate, George Godfrey, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, August 15th, 1911, 175 pounds. Philadelphia Jack O'Brien was a light heavyweight champion earlier in his career. Stanley Ketchum, April 27th, 1910. Stanley Ketchum was a middleweight champion. Two men fought for 6 rounds. No decision. Sam Langford was paid to take it easy on Stanley Ketchum. Contended to see he would get a World Middleweight Championship title shot. Stanley Ketchum was willing to give it to him. Unfortunately, he was killed by Walter Dipley. And Sam Langford would never get that opportunity. Colored World Champions. November 12, 1907. Colored Middleweight Champion, young Peter Jackson. Sam Langford would be in the ring with him 6 times. Joe Jeanette, World Colored Heavyweight Champion, 14 times. Jack Johnson, World Colored Heavyweight Champion, 1 time. Sam McVeigh, World Colored Heavyweight Champion, 15 times. Harry Wills, World Colored Heavyweight Champion, 22 times. Look out for part 2 of the Color Line, right here on the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series.